It's not that AI is not the problem, and modern technology is not the problem. It's this overall mechanistic, rationalistic viewpoint. System thinking had done great things in that period, and it seemed to me to be in decline. And one of the reasons I thought was in decline was that it had splintered into factions. Rather than appearing as warring factions, you could actually see strength in the diversity of systems approaches. There's a play by Bertolt Brecht on Galileo, and it ends with Galileo saying, just make sure that your next scientific invention is met with joy rather than a universal cry of horror. A fantastic attempt to, if you like, find a third way between top-down Soviet-style communism and freewheeling capitalism, an attempt to design freedom. If you try to judge whether you're winning the Vietnam War using systems engineering, you end up counting body bags. The demand for system thinking is great. The supply is not you. Not the brain system thinking is not you. So you get people entering the market and selling you sort of charlatan versions. We lose relationships to ourselves. We as human beings, we become less than we potentially could be because of the loss of communication with people, with nature, with the spiritual aspects of life.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cyb3rSyn Labs Podcast. Today's special guest is nothing short of a rock star in the world of systems thinking. I'm super excited to have Dr. Michael C. Jackson as the guest today. Dr. Michael C. Jackson is Emeritus Professor at the University of Hull and MD of Systems Research. Mike has received many awards, 2 honorary degrees, and has been a visiting professor at numerous international universities. He has been central to the development of critical systems thinking. He is the author of several books, including the latest one published by Wiley in June 2024, titled Critical Systems Thinking, a Practitioner's Guide, which we will be discussing today. To me personally, my journey with him started with this book, Systems Thinking, Creative Holism for Managers. And when I saw Ackoff's recommendation in the back sleeve that all those in the field must read it, I was obsessed. And ever since, I have read every single book that Mike has published. And I have no doubt that today's session is going to be epic, no pun intended. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Look forward to the next hour or so.
Awesome. So, Mike, I want to start with your journey and your worldview. Stories are what move us deeply. And so talk to us a little bit about your own journey into systems thinking, cybernetics, complexity.
Okay, well, I was a social scientist initially. I studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford University. So I came into systems through a social science background. Naturally, as part of a course like that, you studied the work of people like Marx and Parsons and Foucault. And they're all systems based in lots of different ways. So I had an interest in systems from that social science education. I then left, and I was to join the civil service. I was always glad that I had some time out of academia. But that interest in systems remained, and while I was in the civil service, I continued to read in the area. And then saw an opportunity to go to Lancaster University to study the MA in Systems in Management, where I was lucky enough to have Peter Checkland as the professor there, and I was very interested in his work, and he supervised my dissertation there. And so instead of doing what I'd intended, which was to use the course to move from the public sector, civil service, to the private sector, I became interested in systems thinking academically, and was lucky enough to get the job back in Hull in a department of what was then operational research. Hull was my hometown, so I was very glad to be going back. Yeah, so that was it. I was inspired by Peter Checkland into making a career of what I'd just had some kind of interest in previously.
Awesome. You worked with some legends in the field like Checkland himself, and you interacted with so many other people like Ackoff. And so do you have any interesting anecdotes or stories to share with us?
I could tell you anecdotes about all of them. I was extremely lucky to meet many of the second generation great, Forrester, briefly, Churchman. Checkland obviously I had a longer association with because he was my professor at Lancaster, very down to earth, nice character. Stafford Beer, I'm inspired by him, met him on a number of occasions, got quite a few anecdotes about him. Some of these anecdotes incidentally are recalled in the book, Systems Thinking and Management of Complexity. Ackoff, you mentioned, and he was perhaps the greatest encouragement to me in my career. I got lots of books sent to me by Ackoff where he puts encouraging remarks in. And so I'll give you an anecdote about Ackoff.
Sure.
He used to stay at my house when he came over to Hull quite frequently because he opened the Centre for System Studies at Hull to come very willingly to help us out with conferences and presentations and so on. He kept a dinner suit at our house. He said he never needed it in the United States. But he needed it for events in the UK. We just got a new dog. It was called Molly. And we were trying to keep it off the furniture at our house. But we left Ackoff with it one day. And when we came back, he was sat with it on our best sofa. And from that day on, we were never able to get the dog off the furniture. But it was meaningful to me because that dog Molly, lived to nearly 19 and only died 2 years ago. Russell died in about 2000, he died in 2009. And so when Molly died, I felt I'd lost my last link with Russ, personal link, through Molly, our dog. But no, he was a great friend and very encouraging throughout my career. And he was an educator. He encouraged you to develop your own ideas. You weren't imposing ideas on you. He wanted to see you make the best of your own thinking and your own way of thinking. And that's what you need in an educator.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Mike. And I'm sorry for your loss. And I know it's double impact because not only you lost your dog, but as you put it, you lost your last connection with Ackoff. That's moving. I've read a lot of your books, and I'm always curious, why do people write books? What motivated you to write your first?
Yeah. Well, I developed that interest in systems thinking at Lancaster, and you were mainly taught soft systems methodology at Lancaster, so that was my into systems thinking. But obviously, when I got the job at Hull after Lancaster, and began to teach systems and to extend the range of the department to operational research, I went back and studied some of the greats in systems thinking, Bogdanov, Bertalanffy, Wiener, Donella Meadows, as well as the more contemporary figures like Checkland, Ackoff, Churchman, Beer. What it appeared to me was that system thinking has had a huge influence at one time, particularly in the 1960s, early 1970s, perhaps. System engineering had been involved in the Apollo program, getting a man on the moon, the methodology they used then. Donella Meadow was right at the beginning of the environmental movement with limits to growth.
Yeah.
Socio-technical systems thinking, some major experiments in Norway, Sweden, elsewhere, trying to create more democratic organization. Stafford Beer's work in Chile for the Allende government. System thinking had done great things in that period, and it seemed to me to be in decline. And one of the reasons I thought was in decline was that it had splintered into factions. So you had the cyberneticians, you had the systems engineers, you had the soft systems thinkers, the system dynamicists. The field had split, fractured. And I think I immediately wanted to somehow reconstitute systems thinking in a way which would enable it to do the great things it had done in the 60s and 70s. And that meant thinking through the relationship between the fractured systems approaches, trying to, if you like, bring the discipline or the transdiscipline, as you prefer to call it, back together again, so that people could see the value in all these different systems approaches.
Yeah.
Rather than appearing as warring factions, you could actually see strength in the diversity of systems approaches and not weakness. So that was my starting point, and I guess the starting point of critical systems thinking, to have a look at the different systems approaches, see what they were good at, how they were limited, and to wonder whether you could use them in combination in a kind of pluralistic that I think was the start of critical systems thinking and me starting to write books.
Awesome. That's well put. Even today, I think this is very relevant because I still see different factions, except it's, complexity versus systems thinking, but we'll get to that later. You're an author and made significant contributions to the field with critical systems thinking. But I'm curious, what are some of the books, talks, or papers that profoundly influenced you along the way? You mentioned Ackoff has given you some books and things like that. So I'm curious, what are the books behind your books and thinking?
Yeah, thank you. Certainly Ackoff's article, The Future of Operational Research is Past. And then he wrote a follow-up article, Resurrecting the Future of Operational Research, and that was about systems thinking. In the first article, he critiqued what we now call hard systems thinking in the form of operational research, and said it had limited applicability. It was useful if you could define a goal and systematically work out the best way to achieve that goal, rather like the NASA program to put a man on the moon. It was possible to use engineering there because it was a relatively well-defined problem. I mean, it was all overly simple, it was complicated, but nevertheless well-defined. And he was arguing that, and he made this sort of break. He was with operational research, a kind of apostasy when he said, the future of operational research is past, and he sets out this future which was about systems thinking, a much broader future where OR or systems thinking could take on the most important strategic problems rather than be limited to operational problems. It could help people decide what to do, not just how to do things efficiently. So that was influential. That opened up to me a whole new way of looking at things. Peter Checkland's book, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice. Checkland was asked many times to do another version of that book, to update it. And he never did, because he said, it must stand as a historical document
Mm.
of what systems thinking was at the time. And he was right to do that, not to update it. It's a great book. It starts with quite a lot of academic stuff, quite a really nice account of the origins of systems thinking in biology and in engineering. But then the reason why he had to break with systems engineering and develop soft systems methodology, because the kind of issues he was facing in management were much more complex than
Yes.
you could deal with using traditional hard systems approaches. He was working on a project where you couldn't define the nature of the problem easily,
Yes.
where there were stakeholders with very different opinions about what should be achieved. One of those projects was the Anglo-French Concorde project to build a supersonic jet airliner. You might think that a systems person would go in there, look at the task that was needed to build a very good, efficient jetliner efficiently, supersonic jetliner efficiently. Of course, it wasn't really about building a supersonic jetliner. It's about politics, an Anglo-French relation,
Mm.
stakeholders, and how to bring them together. And so it was a revelation to him that all these matters had to be dealt with when you dealt with complex problems. And then it goes on to describe soft systems methodology and the action research program, whereby he continued to develop soft systems methodology over 30 odd years, over 300 plus projects. It's the exemplar of action research in systems thinking over that length of time. And you can see, I've recently written the paper, you can see how the projects he was working on influenced the methodology and allowed him to develop methodology over that period. The exemplar of how to do systems research to action research. Stafford Beers, of all his books, I like Brain of the Firm. It starts with that comparison between neurophysiology, the brain and the body, and how they operate, and how a firm might operate if it's going to be viable, adaptive over time. I found that a very convincing argument. I thought, well, there's a lot to learn from biology, from the study of organisms, about how systems generally need to be ordered, how they need to function in order to survive, to be agile over time. And the second edition of that book describes the work he did for the Allende government, which is someone who's always been, like me, who's always been on the left of politics. Seemed to me, a fantastic attempt to, if you like, find a third way between top-down Soviet-style communism and freewheeling capitalism, an attempt to design freedom, as his small books put it. So those three texts were important to me, but also Bogdanov. When I started reading his stuff a bit later, Wiener's, particularly like the human use of human beings. Some people, you want to talk about complexity theories. A lot of complexity theories tend to think that systems thinking is about order. They're dealing with process. Read The Human Use of Human Being by Wiener. He's a process thinker, but he's interested in how order displays itself, how it comes about through negative entropy. It's all about order out of processual world. Bertalanffy, I wish people would read, or at least reread, that collection of papers that goes under the title General Systems Theory. People tend to associate Bertalanffy with the notion that you could produce a theory of systems of all kinds. But the book is as much about emergence and the different kinds of theories you need at different levels, as it is about creating a general systems theory. And that was liberating to recognize that you couldn't use the same theories that were applicable in physics to understand biology, the emerging
Yes.
you couldn't use the same theories that were available in physics or biology to understand human behavior. The Skinnerian stimulus response stuff. You had to accept that there was a mind there, as Boulding put it. There was a mind in an image in brain which interprets the world and modifies the stimulus response. I find a lot in all these important systems books, and that's why I'm so keen on people being, if they want to do systems thinking, talk about systems thinking, work with systems ideas, in knowing something of the history of the transdiscipline. Otherwise, they end up reinventing the wheel or doing things which people in the past have recognized don't work.
Yeah. Well said. I'm glad you mentioned Stafford Beer's books. As you can tell, I am a big fan of Stafford Beer, and my startup is called Cyb3rSyn Labs after Beer's project Cybersyn.
Yeah.
So super glad you mentioned that. I like him because, he explored cybernetics from the lens of management. Obviously, he came up with management cybernetics, and that is my passion as well, to apply it to management and leadership and transform it and move away from mainstream practices.
Fantastic. Yeah, the shift away from the mechanistic model to a more organismic perception of what management and organizational structures might be like.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he summarized in those books 60, 70 years of organization theory. You all those many books written about systems and contingency theory about in organization. You can find all the insights there in Beer, and not only insights, but explanations of why things work that way because of the cybernetic concepts he employed. Help you to understand why things operate and work the way they do.
Yeah. Now I want to pivot to kind of the history and future of systems thinking, how we got to now and where do we go. And I'm from India and my mother tongue is Tamil. And when I go back and read literature, very rich literature from 2000 plus years ago, I find systems ideas there. And I think those, for the lack of a better word, they are lindy and they have survived through the filter of time. But for some reason, they are anti-mimetic in the sense it's not widespread. I don't know how much you've researched Eastern philosophies, especially Tamil, but I know you've looked into like Russian philosophy and things like that. But at least from Western traditions and philosophies, please talk to us about how we got to now. And while you're talking about it, I would also love to hear if you think systems thinking has a bad rap, and what can we do to bring the esoteric into the exoteric.
That's quite a few questions.
We'll take it one at a time.
Well, look, I have always been interested in Eastern philosophy. In fact, the latest book I've been reading is about, it's called Himalaya, about the rise of, it's about the civilizations that existed in Tibet and Nepal and Tibetan Buddhism. I've dabbled with Zen Buddhism. I've read a fair amount of the Vedas and Buddhist texts. I know nothing about Tamil philosophy. Recently, I don't know it, but I've seen people bringing forward ideas from indigenous tradition. There's a well-known book, Sand Talk, isn't there, from the Australian Aboriginal tradition.
Australian, right?
Yeah. And there are papers written on systems thinking from a North American tradition, First World tradition. So yeah, there's a lot there about relationships, particularly in all those traditions. I think the concept of relationships is something that's there, that's something that we lost a lot going forward through the development in the West, at least, and the development of the Western tradition. But of course, in Western philosophy, the holistic notions come forward in Aristotle. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. He more or less says in various points, not quite exactly. Plato, the notion of the steersman. Some go back to earlier pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, process orientation. So they were there. I've got recently quite an interest in Spinoza from the Western canon, although I think he was influenced by some Eastern philosophy as well. The notion of God or nature he talks about, this one whole thing that we appreciate in different ways. I can see elements of the development of pragmatism in there. He has this Anecdotes whereby a being needs to reach its own potential, whatever type of being it is, And that's taken up by things like the environmental movement. You shouldn't rob an animal of reaching its potential or what it can be as an animal, whether it's a hen or a dog or whatever it is. It's like Spinoza that's really interesting. And after Spinoza, of course, you get Hegel, dialectic and systems ideas there, which have taken, certainly influenced people like Churchman. And you get Marx. Bogdanov was a Marxist, although he disagreed fundamentally with Lenin in the form of Marxism, which he eventually adopted. But I love the trajectory that Bogdanov took. What an influential guy he was for the time. What wonderful books he wrote. So if you haven't read his science fiction books, then they describe. I've written an article which relate Bogdanov's work to Cyb3r's work and the similarities between the way they were thinking in terms of Bogdanov had the notion of a utopian communist society. Happened to, in his science fiction, it happened to be on Mars, and he was looking at Earth and seeing this wonderful utopian society on Mars and wondered whether it could be brought back to Earth. But there are many similarities with the kind of society Beer describes in Designing Freedom, where he takes an Aristotelian notion, doesn't he, of the good life. Wonders how that might be somehow made real in social systems. So, and then you've got, with Bert Ladford, you've got the organismic trend coming in, as organisms clearly more complex, you couldn't understand them through physical laws. And through people like Wiener and the cybernetic trend, you've got the engineering aspects entering in. Cybernetics was very tied in with canon and the notion of feedback as well. So all these things entered into the Western tradition of systems thinking and got us to where we are now. The one I didn't mention was pragmatism, but Bogdanov was a very much a pragmatist. And of course, Churchman was very much influenced by E.A. Singer, who was a student of William James, and you've got this pragmatist view tradition developing in U.S. systems thinking carried forward by Churchman and Ackoff. Again, it might be something we talk about, but I see a potential unifying philosophy for systems thinking as being pragmatism.
Awesome. Do you think the word systems thinking itself has a bad rap? Like, what can we do? Why is it still esoteric? That's the second part of that question.
I think it deservedly got a bad rap when people tried to extend the kind of systems thinking that had got the man on the moon to the social domain. well, it simply didn't work. There were lots of experiments in the US transferring systems in geosystems analysis to urban problems. Got around in California. The Vietnam War is probably the famous example. You know, if you try to judge whether you're winning the Vietnam War using systems engineering, you end up counting bad body back.
Yes.
No, it's and then you've got a whole host of criticisms of systems thinking, from Ober's law, from Lilienfeld, and others. And I think that attempt to transfer hard systems approaches unsuccessfully to the social domain set back systems thinking for a generation at least, and it got a bad rap. And it's been hard for it to escape that. I would agree. But I think the tide's turned, and systems thinking actually is an approach which can take you away from and allow you to see the world more broadly than the sort of mechanistic ways with which it was, mechanistic thinking was which it was perhaps associated in those early days. Let's improve efficiency. That you could see. And it allows you to see the world through alternative lenses, through organismic lenses, through purposeful lenses, people and their ambitions and what they want to achieve. Through societal lenses, who's benefiting, who's not benefiting from the way society operates. Through environmental lens, what are we doing in terms of our relationship to the environment? It's actually system thinking that can allow you to escape from a narrow perspective on the way the world is and the way the world should be and the way we should intervene in the world, and opens up alternative ways of seeing things and operating in the world. And I think this is beginning to be recognized. So for me, I've never seen as much interest in systems thinking as I'm witnessing now.
Yes.
I wish I was 30 years younger to see. I've been pushing for it so long. And now it's happening. As far as I can see, the level of interest in systems thinking is going massive. And it's hardly surprising because increasing recognition that traditional ways of thinking and acting are not working and lead us to a range of problems which we only seem to make worse when we continue to use the approaches that we've employed in the past, ridiculously beyond any kind of help that they might be able to lend to us.
Yeah. I 100% agree that the awareness about systems thinking and interest in systems thinking is improving. But what I'm worried about is it becoming another Buddhism or Agile, where consultants come in and turn it into a simple methodology. They reduce it, and it completely turns to mess after a couple decades. How do we prevent that from happening?
That's really hard work, isn't it? And it goes back to what I was saying about systems thinking, education in systems thinking. There are universities which teach systems thinking. Almost all educational establishments teach individual disciplines, not advanced disciplines like systems thinking. And they tend to teach them in reductionist ways. So you get, 99% of the education that people get at school and in universities is reductionist rather than holist, if you want to put it in very broad, in very terms. There's nothing stopping apart from that. There are resistances, of course, the reasons why that's happened. But you could develop a curriculum based upon systems thinking and holism, which would be equally valid to any curriculum based upon reductionism and individual discipline. You could go back to the philosophers we began talking about in the Western and the Eastern tradition. You could lead up to the breakthroughs of Bogdanov, Bertolt Wiener, then the Boystoin. You can relate them to the different philosophies, and you can relate them to the kind of practices that people adopt in the world. And that would be a wholly equally legitimate way of looking at the history of philosophy and social theory, thinking generally, as what we're getting now. But that's not the case. We're not in that position. So somehow establishing system thinking as a legitimate discipline, transdiscipline in universities, I think is important. So that there's some filter on the nonsense you sometimes see associated with systems thinking, because there's a lack of a filter where people say, well, this is legitimate, this builds upon what's gone before. This understands what's happened in the past, where people have got things right, where people have got things wrong, how the transdiscipline has developed over time, what it's learned, what it's not learned. Unless you've got that filter, then people are always going to come forward and almost start the thing again, or try to start the thing again. And because of that, also you get consultancies trying, because system thinking is becoming popular, the demand for system thinking is great. The supply is not huge, not the brain system thinking is not huge. So you get people entering the market and selling you sort of charlatan versions of, which is not going to do our transdiscipline and the thing that we have belief can actually do some useful things. That's not going to do that any good at all. Can be, maybe, if it were left to those kinds of people, then it would be seen as a passing fad. In the same way like TQM were, business process reengineering and agile. So that's the theory side, but there's also a practice side. And it's the linking of the theory and the practice which is crucial to me. I've never been interested. The reason I gave up social science and went into systems thinking was because it was an applied discipline. Not many people write in system thinking while thinking about what a difference it makes to the way they may act in the world. I mean, there's some lunatics that still seek a general theory of everything. For the most part, people are thinking about what difference does it mean if you think this way to the way I might act in the world. And so it's an applied discipline. That's what I loved about it. I like social science, but I wanted to be able to do something, to change things. And systems thinking gave me that avenue to develop different ways of thinking, also different ways of doing things. And that means, particularly as somebody who's now pragmatist in orientation, I need to be able to see that these ideas have validity and usefulness in practice. And that's why I become an advocate of action research as well as a means of operationalizing pragmatism. Where you take a theory, you try it out in practice, and you learn about the way you're trying out in practice, the methodology, you learn about the theory, and you learn about the change you've managed to make in the world. Checkland called it the framework of ideas, the methodology, and the area of concern. Link those three things together. Theory on its own is no good. And it goes off into its own realms of discourse. Practice on its own is no good unless you're reflecting back on, what you're thinking about the world and what that practice is telling you. Those two things together, a virtuous circle of theory and practice, is the kind of thing that I would advocate, and which Checkland did as an exemplar, Ackoff did over many, many studies. That's the way to develop systems thinking, and that's what we've got to get back to. Not theory alone or not practice alone. Practice alone is just like consultancy. Theory alone is just, up in the clouds.
Yes. Well said, Mike. I am a big fan of Kurt Lewin, the practical theorist, and I've found a lot of value in not just reading the theory, but trying to apply it and learn from practice. And that's when you accumulate scar tissue and you actually learn from your mistakes.
Yeah.
And, I see myself as a Silicon Valley insider, rebelling against mainstream management practices here in the Valley. And I'm trying to do my little part to spread the message and insights from systems thinking. Do you think, converts like me, insiders like me, rebelling against what's going on in the mainstream, is it really helping? From this lens, like Dan Davies's book, The Unaccountability Machine, I thought was a contribution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That book is important in getting the Stafford Beer model to a much wider audience, and I think exactly what you're saying is right. If to take one example, we have a guy called Bartley Madden coming over to the conference that we'll talk about later, who's written a few books on value creation, become very interested in systems thinking, and has a book called Pragmatic Theory of the Firm as well. And from a business perspective, he was heavily involved in Credit Suisse. From a business perspective, he's adopting this kind of thinking. So yeah, insiders, and I could give you examples in a variety of logistics, in risk, in project management, where people from those disciplines are getting hold of systems thinking and critical systems thinking, and broadening their perspective that way. I was actually giving a talk in Bucharest just a couple of weeks ago. It was in the Business Systems Laboratory conference, and I was talking about critical systems thinking and artificial intelligence. So, in thinking about those things, and it's the first time I really thought hard about them, I must admit. And what you realize is that AI can be a real friend. There are things it does really well. If you, as a pragmatist, I've looked into the ways of looking at the world that have proven useful to people over time. We'd be nowhere if we hadn't developed a mechanistic, rational way of looking at the world. And AI can help us to be more efficient, to reach goals more efficiently. If you think about the sort of organismic view of the world, how can we be resilient and survive? How can we be agile and adaptive? Then the kind of monitoring of weak signals that AI can do by mining whole loads of data, clearly going to be useful to us. In terms of building system dynamics models, math, AI can do it spectacularly well, where those models are useful, not often, but when they are useful, when the world stays stable enough for a model of that kind of useful, and AI can help. Discourse, but the purposeful perspective, as I describe it, different stakeholder viewpoints, it can help illuminate them. It can't come to a decision and decide, it shouldn't come to a decision and decide, tell you what to do, but it can help with, things like societal issues. It can tell you who's being marginalized. Can't tell you how to act ethically, morally in that circumstance, but it can tell you. So you can see it as a friend, but this requires a bigger mind shift as well. If it's not going to become an enemy, it's not that AI is not the problem, and modern technology is not the problem. It's this overall mechanistic, rationalistic viewpoint that Heidegger, for example, identified, where everything's there to use.
Yeah.
You're trying to predict and control everything. A mechanistic perspective on the world. When that dominates, then AI can be used in the service of that. And other ways of relating to the world, as Heidegger might put it, are pushed out by that particular strong viewpoint. So we lose the connection with nature. That becomes a standing reserve to be used in a particular way for some purposes undefined that we're not in control of. We lose our relationship with other human beings who would themselves become part of the standing reserve to be used in the service, if you like, of a rationalistic machine.
Yeah.
We lose relationships to ourselves. We know, as human beings, we become less than we potentially could be because of the loss of communication with people, with nature, with the spiritual aspects of life. That your Tamil tradition might link you back. You've got maybe got an easier way back there than a lot of us without that look to have that background have. But we lose our potential as human beings. I read some very good book recently called Being a Human and Being Human. And this traces the history of the development of scientific thought and the Enlightenment. Progress that's been made. Nobody wants to get rid of that mechanistic stuff. It's vital. When I much rather if with that stuff around me, but only contained, properly contained, not dominating everything. And what we've done is lose a lot of our potential ways of looking at the world. As animals, as types of animal that has a enchantment with the reality with which we live, and can see the glory of it. I think the Romantics talked about, they opted to the scientific revolution if it was just about mathematics and quantification. They're in favor of the Enlightenment if it embraced the increase in human potential through poetry, through literature, through different ways of seeing, through the mind and what the mind could achieve. The Romantics were all about that. From Kant, you got the notion that we're not simply the product of an environment imposing on us. We have minds which interpret the environment, and the Romantics took that further and say, what is the potential of the mind for interpreting the environment? We're not limited. There's a huge human potential to be released here.
Yes.
And what we've done is the exact opposite. Somehow, decrease what we're capable of as human beings by making ourselves into parts and cogs in this machine which we seem unable to control. So, that for me is where Silicon Valley can learn from critical systems thinking, how to make AI and other new technologies realize what they can do and be a friend to us, help us, not become part of this rationalistic, mechanistic worldview, which seems to be potentially leading us to destruction.
Yes, well said. I worked with a lot of tech executives over the last 25 years or so, and I think the STEM types have oversaturated, and I think we need a bull run in humanities again.
But they must want that. A lot of them must want that. What's the point of doing that work if you don't somehow think that you're benefiting humanity rather than crushing it? They must want this broader perspective that I think systems thinking can bring. AI, these new technologies are blind unless you have this broader perspective, which allows you to see their place.
Yes.
And the way that they can benefit human beings rather than the opposite. There's a play by Bertolt Brecht on Galileo, and it ends with Galileo saying, just make sure that your next scientific invention is met with joy rather than a universal cry of horror.
Wow.
What you'd want to think, wouldn't you? That people welcomed what you're doing in technology and science and not got, oh my God, no, not something else to oppress me or to take my time away.
Was it? I now want to pivot and talk about the systems thinking, systems practice conference, which is, I think, named after Peter Checkland's book. A lot of the listeners of the podcast who are tech people and Silicon Valley types. So why should an executive in Silicon Valley, of course, you just gave that answer in talking about the importance of systems thinking and being able to see the human side of things. But why should they attend this conference in specific?
Yeah, okay, let me bring it down to earth and why they should attend this conference.